Yeah, we talk a lot on this show about, global geopolitics because this affects us. And, we've discussed ad nauseum the Middle East and how disgusting our policies have been in the Middle East. We've created every end of radical Islam in the Middle East. And I'm just going to run down 1927, the British intelligence created the Muslim Brotherhood. You look at Israeli intelligence created Hamas in 1974. These are all of their enemies they created. So I'm sick of it. We've had this policy. Judicial Watch sued and got the FOIA. They got the FOIA request, and it showed all of the information that we were funding all of the radical, jihadis.
Hey,
all,
maybe that's where that money went, right?
Yeah, that's 6.5 trillion. But look, Dr. Tim Anderson has written a great book. I've got it on order. I haven't received it yet. Damn you, Amazon. But anyway, look, it's called The Dirty War on Syria, Washington Regime Change and Resistance. So look, I'm very excited to be able to talk to Professor Anderson because he is coming all the way, from Sydney, Australia. So it's a long ways from New Orleans. I believe 15 hours ahead of us. So, Dr. Anderson, welcome to the program. Welcome to Battle of New Orleans Radio. We surely appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks very much. I think from what you say, I think it must be evening or late afternoon there. It's morning here.
Yes, sir. It's 7:21, 7:22 p.m. Central Standard Time.
What time you have over there, Doctor?
It's just gone 10 a.m. in the morning here.
Oh, not too bad. I'm glad we didn't wake you up at 5 in the morning.
No, it's not too bad.
All right, good deal.
Yeah, I don't know, Doctor, if you heard, what I was saying about the 6.5 trillion that come out of, that report from Reuters that shows, there's some mishaps here from the Pentagon. I mean, what's your take on that? I'd like to get your take on that because I believe it's very serious, before you discuss your book.
Yeah, it is very serious. I can't say I have any special knowledge about that. I know that there was talk about that from your former Defence Minister Cheney some years ago. One large amount that went missing back in 2001, but I don't have any special knowledge about those secret funds. Of course, there's such a lot that's secret these days. I was looking at a video where a congressman was interviewing one US bureaucrat, and he said, we can't show these things to Congress, we can't even show it to Congress people, some of the information that they have there. So certainly there's a big secret state going on there in the US, and I'm sure that US citizens are very concerned about that. I've really focused on how people are impacted in other cultures by our, and by our, I mean the Australian as well as the US operations in other parts of the world, in particular the Middle East. So I'm paying a bit less attention to the internal problems.
Can you speak to the relationship between the United States and Australia and part of the New World Order and their position in the Asia Pacific? I mean, how does that all work?
Okay, well, in a nutshell, I mean, you were just talking about the US and the Muslim Brotherhood and the British and so on. Of course, the British really got to learn to use sectarian extremism after the fall of the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago, when they got that relationship with the Al Saud family, which now has a country called after it. And of course, when the US became the big power in the world after the Second World War, the British handed Al Saud across to President Eisenhower, really in the 50s, so that was where the British really passed on the baton to Washington in respect of extremist sectarians in the Middle East. In terms of Australia, we were a colony of Britain, like the US was, I guess, but we didn't fight for our independence. We remained tied to Britain until the 40s, when the Japanese took over Singapore, and then we switched our big brother relationship to Washington in 1942. So ever since then, there's been relationships, close sort of dependent relationships that our capital in Canberra has had with Washington, and still with some influence from Britain and the Europeans, but basically in all strategic matters outside our region, the Australian governments, whatever party, are pretty much in lockstep with what Washington's doing. The only exceptions really are some things in the region here, in the Pacific Islands, some of the things going on in our region. But anything in the Middle East, Australia is really one of those little dependent partners that latches onto what Washington happens to be doing in the Middle East.
So you're kind of a stooge for the Australia is kind of a stooge for the United States, or
pretty much like Canada, similar sort of role to Canada in a way.
Yeah, gotcha.
I got you. Dr. Anderson, David and I, we have talked, just at ends on the radio about, Syria and about how the Syrians have been treated. 2012, they started really pushing this whole narrative really hard that, we got to get Assad, and then, they had this whole phony deal with the chemical weapons. And later, other nations reported that they really couldn't confirm that or that was false. I mean, it sounded pretty, respectably similar to, Iraq. It was kind of the similar narrative. So, I mean, ever since then, we've really took a dump on Syria and really helped slaughter hundreds of thousands of people because of what we're doing over there by supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and all these other groups, taking down the Assad regime, which was a pretty good regime overall, considering in the Middle East, compared to, our
what's going on now.
Yeah, and compared to our great ally in Saudi Arabia. So please, Dr. Anderson, please go into Syria and what's really going on there.
Yeah, well, you're right. Syria, in regional terms, is really the most pluralistic, tolerant society in the whole region. Basically, it's based on what they call secularism. I think we probably more call pluralism. They're not anti-religion, but they have got this big, very diverse community, lots and lots of minorities, as well as ordinary mainstream Muslims. But they're not fanatical. They're at that crossroads between Europe and the Middle East, and they, have that mixture of different cultures that they like. They really like it. I've been to Syria 4 times now, and you notice one of the things in the Syrian character is they love the fact that there's the church bells are going off when the call to prayer is going off, and there's that whole mixture of things. The women have a much higher status than any of the other Arab countries around them. Basically, they can choose whether or not to wear the hijab.
Hey, the Dr. Anderson, hold that thought. We're coming to a break. Yeah, that I believe that's why, another reason we must take them down. They're not radical enough. We must take down all these non-violent regimes and replace them with radicals. Ladies and gentlemen, you listen to Battle of New Orleans Radio. We have Dr. Tim Anderson from Sydney, Australia on. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. You're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio right here on 990 AM WGSO in the heart of the Crescent City. We have Dr. Tim Anderson on Skype with us discussing Syria and our roles and our involvement in the Middle East. Dr. Anderson, please continue where you left off.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, look, the targeting of Syria is really nothing to do with the nature of Syrian democracy or anything else about Syria, really. It was Syria's turn. We've really had one war going on for the last 15 years. It's not several wars. It wasn't just the war in Afghanistan,
right.
The war in Iraq, the war on Libya, the war on Syria, the one that almost happened with Iran. And, there is a strong link between all of those. We know that there was a plan back in 2001. It was announced. Yeah, it was announced later in 2005, 2006 to create a new Middle East, to get rid of those areas in the Middle East which did not have US bases, which did not have a strong link into the military strategy of the big powers in that region. And who was that? That was Iran, that was Syria, that was Libya, that was a part of Lebanon that resists Israel. So really after Libya, Syria was meant to be Libya take 2, but it wasn't that easy, was it? The resistance was very strong. The Syrians were behind their army. They're still behind their army, and the Syrians have got strong friends. And that's what Washington faces today, that now the most recent thing is that the Russians are using Iranian air bases to bomb all of the terrorist groups in Syria, not just the ones they call extremists, the ones they call moderates. Really, they're effectively the same thing. But China's announced that it's bought into this too, so there's another fly in the ointment for the big plan.
Wait, I have to just step back for 1 second because I had a question in mind, and then you mentioned Iran because I had forgotten about Iran. But Russia and Iran are obviously allied with Syria. But now you're saying that is China?
China was providing aid, like humanitarian aid, to Syria for a while, but holding back from the military side of things. And just in the last few days, they've said that they are entering into military cooperation, training, some other engagement with Syria. So politically, it's very important that China's made that move officially just in the last few days.
It's very disheartening, Dr. Anderson, to watch all this as an American, because I'm gonna be honest with you, most Americans don't support any of this. I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you, and people are gonna say I'm an American. Hey, I love my nation. I want to be free. I love liberty. I want freedom. I want us to all have, these unalienable rights. But I find myself rooting for Russia and Syria and China because it seems like they're fighting the New World Order.
They're fighting the radical Islamists that we've been caught funding.
Yeah, we funded and created. I mean, it's crazy. What planet am I living in, Doctor?
I was reminded of that old saying you must have heard it. I thought it was Shakespeare. It's actually Walter Scott who said, "Oh, what a tangled weave when first we practice to deceive."
Yeah.
The Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and the Iraqis, let's remember, are really say they're doing the same thing as the US in the region. Everyone says they're on the same page. Of course, they're not on the same page, but they say it. And the problem is that Washington has painted itself into a corner by saying they're against these extremists when the evidence has been very, very strong. And I detailed in my book, and you can get it at Global Research, by the way. I don't know if it's on Amazon.
Yeah, it is. I should have ordered it. I should have ordered it from Global Research.
Right. That the Washington in the last few years has been funding and arming every single anti-government group in Syria and Iraq to try and divide those countries and to weaken them, basically. And you've had Vice President Biden admitting this 2 years ago. You've had the head of the armed forces, General Martin Dempsey, admitting it. The head of the Congressional Committee, I believe, on the armed forces, Lindsey Graham, admitting it. But we've still got this narrative in the corporate media that you started off talking about of the moderate rebels this, the moderate rebels that. It's a fig leaf, it's a fig leaf that's over, the embarrassment of Washington at the moment. And that's, I think, where a lot of frustration and confusion comes in our Western cultures.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Our own co-host and reporter, Caleb Hitt, for the dailyresistance.com, interviewed Congressman Bill Johnson from Ohio, Doctor. And Congressman Johnson said, "Oh, look, I was in Israel in the Golan Heights, which really belongs to Syria. I was in Israel in the Golan Heights, and I was watching, the moderate Syrian rebels. Some of them were Al Qaeda. They knew it was Al Qaeda was crossing over into Israel, and the Israelis are so great. They were bandaging them up and sending them back across. What our own politicians admit." Things like this. I mean, but
Hey,
it's go ahead, David.
I interviewed John McCain, and he said he knew these people.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
like he went to high school with these Syrian rebels. He could vouch for them. So I asked him, how do you vet these folks? Oh, don't worry about it. He knew them. He knew them.
They must be pretty old rebels if they went to school with John McCain.
Yeah, they crutching around the desert over there, apparently.
Well, he's such a traitor.
So, but the thing is that John McCain is still in office.
He's a war criminal. I mean, they committed war crimes.
So, but now we've got this populist here, Donald Trump, who came out against John McCain, the only one who really has the bravado, the guts, or whatever to say, this guy, there's something wrong with him, and he's really pointed out how terrible Lindsey Graham and John McCain and all these congressmen are who are these practicing this Machiavellian politics. Dr. Tim, what do you think of the elections going on, and how big of a role is this playing in the geopolitical spectrum, Russia and Syria and Donald Trump? I mean, it sounds like we have hope. We have somebody's actually, saying things that are, true. So that's good. What do you think about all this from Australia?
Well, I'm not a North American, so I don't really have a voice in the North American politics. But of course, it does have an impact on the debate, doesn't it? And obviously, there's a very clear distinction between the continuity of these, what I call dirty wars, in Syria and in Iraq and in Libya. It was too, in terms of one candidate that's been supporting those dirty wars and one that says he wants to pull the US out of those dirty wars, So whether that's actually what's going to happen is another story, because I think the Syrian president made the point a month or so ago that, it's election campaign and we don't pay too much attention to what they say in election campaigns. It's what comes out at the other end, because
Great point.
Sometimes they can be much more of the same.
Smart, yeah, absolutely.
It's true that you would say for people outside the US or people being affected by these wars, that they see some greater hope and promise in the fact that one of the candidates is saying, why shouldn't we have a good relationship with Russia? Why shouldn't we support the Middle East leaders that are getting rid of these extremists, So that's refreshing to people outside the US, I've got to say.
Yeah, no doubt. That is a great point. Look, Dr. Tim Anderson, we're about to go to break. Look, when we get back, I would like for you to break down to the listeners why and how these are dirty wars, because they obviously are very dirty, because millions of people have lost their lives from the Western policies.
What does that mean, dirty wars? Let's get to it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, listen to Battle of New Orleans Radio. Please go support Dr. Tim Anderson. You can find his work, The Dirty War in Syria, at Global Research. Go check it out. That is also a great, great website. You can find a lot of great information there that you will not find on the mainstream lying prostitute whore media. We'll be right back.
Battle of New Orleans Radio with your hosts Nathan Lawrenson, Caleb Hitt, and Goyam on 990 WGSO.
In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. You're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio. We have Dr. Tim Anderson, the author of The Dirty War on Syria, Washington, Regime Change, and Resistance. And we don't like resistors. Dr. Anderson, I asked you to, please break down why and how this is a dirty war. So, please go on and please explain to us.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, in Syria, some people ask me why dirty war? Aren't all wars dirty? And I said, well, yeah, but really what I'm taking a leaf out of here is the Latin American experience. You might remember back in the 80s, the Contra War against Nicaragua, for example, which was branded a terrorist war by the International Court of Justice, and which did no good for that little country, of course. So what I mean by dirty war is that they are based on lies. Maybe once again, all wars are based on lies. But in this case, what we've got is a proxy war. We've got proxy armies of extremists, whether it's the Free Syrian Army or al-Nusra, al-Qaeda or ISIS, any of those, al-Zenki, Fatah al-Sham, any of those groups, they've all been financed and armed by North American weapons, money from the close allies, the Saudis, Qatar, Turkey, a NATO member. So the lying pretexts for those wars have had to be carried on by the governments, the Western governments to support this project, and by the corporate media that reflect those governments' wartime narrative. The wartime narrative is a very tightly controlled one. I found it very surprising that there were so few chinks in the first few years, at least, where you could hear a different version of things. They black banned people, they blacklisted people in the corporate media. So that's why I call it a dirty war. It's based on misinformation. It's using misinformation to fool and confuse people, to pretend that the Syrian president was killing his own civilians, you look at those sorts of incidents closely, you look at the evidence, you'll find they were fabrications in the first place, a series of fabrications. Not to say the Syrian army isn't killing people and doesn't have some collateral damage, but it's an army that's backed up by its people. And the idea that, the extremist groups are being fought by the Western countries, again, ridiculous. So that's what I mean by dirty war. It's using a lot of disinformation to confuse people, to disarm the objection to a war being carried out in their name, in our name, against extremists, when in fact we are backing those extremists against one of the more decent governments in the region.
I want the listening audience to let all of this resonate. I mean, because we hear this, and I don't think we really go look in the mirror and say this out loud. We are funding ISIS. We are funding and steering, and in some points we have, Western backing. There's been Israeli generals been running arms of ISIS, and CIA has been running. I mean, it's just ridiculous. In the same name, then you get, Barack Obama. The peace,
Obama.
Yeah, the peacetime president. He gets up there. Oh, we're fighting ISIS. Man, come on! You are the commander in chief of ISIS.
And he got the Nobel Peace,
look,
Peace Prize.
I was in Palmyra in April this year. Palmyra, that was taken over by
Right.
ISIS last year. A lot of Syrian soldiers lost their life when that town was taken over. Syria got it back from ISIS this year, March this year. A lot of Syrian soldiers lost their lives getting it back from Palmyra. I was walking around. They'd only been there a few weeks ago. I picked up some shells on the ground. I said to a Syrian soldier, "Is this one of yours or one of theirs?" And he had a look at it. It was about a 50 mil shell, fairly heavy shell. And it was an American shell,
Oh, my gosh.
Virtually all their weapons. There were some Israeli weapons, but virtually all their weapons were American weapons.
Dr. Anderson, I hate to cut you off. I mean, this is hitting me so hard because you have been there. You're talking about how you've gone there after this major, campaign. ISIS and Syrians kicked them out of Palmyra. Tell us, I've seen some video. Americans are not exposed to what is going on in Syria. We live in a total vacuum. And Nathan talks about it all the time, and until we're blue in the face. What does Syria look like? And folks, do you hear what this man is saying? American weapons, 50 cal, it's an American cartridge. I mean, this is a shell from something our military,
our tax dollars, your tax dollars
has given them,
are killing innocent children.
When ISIS left Palmyra, they robbed the hospital that had been recently refitted, and they took the stuff from the hospital in Hummers, right? So they drove the Hummers back to Palmyra, back to Iraq, back to Raqqa and back to Iraq from Palmyra. So all of those sorts of things were being, of course, the US, which had planes supposedly bombing ISIS last year, since late 2014, really, they didn't hit them at all when they were going across the open desert. There's a lot of open desert in eastern Syria, open desert into Palmyra, hundreds of kilometers of open desert, a convoy of Hummers and other sorts of vehicles from eastern Syria and Iraq. They didn't hit them at all on the way. They didn't stop them going to Palmyra. The only time that the US planes were hitting them was when they were affecting their allies. One of the groups of Kurds in the north of Iraq, when they went in there, the Yazidis, you might remember that. Then they bombed them to sort of cattle prod them, to shepherd them out of that area. But when ISIS went into Palmyra, they didn't touch them. And they went in with American weapons.
I want to curse on the radio so bad. I can't.
Well, Dr. Anderson is bringing the human element to everybody. We know all of this, but when you hear people that have been there and have really brought the human element, it's sickening. I swear, I want to make it my mission to go to these countries like Syria and Iran, because the lying media tells everybody we can't go, that all these people are our enemies. No, they're not the enemies. The people that control the central banking cartel that make these wars happen, These are our enemies. All wars are bankers' wars, and it is disgusting. Go ahead, Doctor. We didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. You're right. It's a good point. You know your audience, and you know what they are missing out on, and perhaps what they need to hear. I mean, it's true. I mean, I don't want to, talk about U.S. politics, but you've got a lot of problems you have to deal with there, and some of these things compete with that, of course. So anyway, in Syria, you'd be very welcome if you went to Syria. They know that if people come from America, they make an extra effort to get there, and they'll take the time to talk to you. But it's a very cultured country. They're very decent people. As I say, they've got this pluralism of religion. The army, the Syrian army, about which a lot of lies have been written, that's made up of Christians, of Sunni Muslims, of Shia Muslims, of Alawis, of Druze, of all of the Armenians. All the different groups in Syria are in that army. And while they had some defections in the early days, that army stuck together and the people have stuck behind them, So that story isn't getting out very well, I don't think, because all we hear in the Western media is, oh, the Syrian army, the Russian, it flowed onto the Russians, same thing. They're just killing civilians every day. For some reason, they're targeting their own civilians. And for some strange reason, that same media doesn't pay attention to the fact that people in Syria are very strongly behind their army. The most popular entity in Syria today, they say, God bless the army, God bless the army. You hear that everywhere. And all of the families have got martyrs, their family members that have died defending that country, doing exactly what an army should, defend their communities, defend their country. So the whole population of Syria is, you could say, up in arms, because their family members, they're the ones that are dying defending their country from all of these mad fanatics and mercenaries that have been thrown at them from all quarters.
That's patriotism. They're showing patriotism for their land.
Absolutely.
Dr. Anderson, I worked with, I know we only have a couple minutes left before another commercial break, but I've worked with a guy who has a lot of military contacts, a lot of law enforcement contacts here. And he has been saying over the last year that he's going to Syria to go drive a truck. He's going to go. So who is he driving? I mean, I didn't ask him about this, and I don't know, what's going on, but it sounds like this plan is, that our military contractors are going to be coming in, taking over some kind of oil line. I mean, is he? What is this? This is is the end game that we have U.S. military contractors driving oil tankers with radical Islamists to Turkey from, Saudi Arabia? How is this? What is your perception of what I just said?
Well, I don't know.
And we might have to get back to this after the break, because I know we're coming up. I hear some music.
Yeah, let's just hold that for the breaks. I know it's going to be a long answer. Look, please go get this man's book. I have it on order. It hasn't there yet, but I look forward to reading it. I read some of the stuff online. It looks fantastic. Please go buy his book, The Dirty War on Syria, and you will learn about really what's going on. You can go to Global Research and order your copy. Please support Dr. Tim Anderson. Listen to Battle of New Orleans Radio. We'll be right back. Put yourself, audience, what if you was a Syrian? What if you was an Afghani goat herder? Ask yourself that.
Support the people that are speaking up for the ones that don't have a voice.
That's right. We'll be right back.
It's the Battle of New Orleans! Radio! Bringing truth to your eardrums! Here we go! It's the Battle of New Orleans! Radio! Bringing truth to your eardrums! Here we go! The last line of defense, bringing truth to the front. Now it's time to...
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. You're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio, right here on 990 AM WGSO. We are talking to Dr. Tim Anderson, the author of The Dirty War on Syria. Look, David, please, talk about, the question you was asking Dr. Anderson before we went to break.
Yeah. So Dr. Anderson, I've been working with a guy last couple of years, and he's got military connections, law enforcement connections. I'm not going to go any further than that. And he's been trying to talk me into driving a oil tanker in Syria.
For ISIS?
He hasn't mentioned who. I don't even want to add. I didn't ask him. But I mean, he's been saying this for over a year. I'm going to Syria. I'm going to go drive a truck, tanker, and I mean, like, so you're driving a tanker for ISIS. I mean, obviously, this guy would probably be working for Blackwater, some kind of military contractor, and so my thinking is the end game is that we want a position in Syria. I say we, I mean in the United States, wants a position in Syria, from my understanding, to get oil from Saudi Arabia, because we are hand in hand with them through Syria into the European markets, because that's the largest oil market. Is that correct? And then Russia, and obviously they supply Europe with oil, so they don't want this going on.
Yeah, well, it's a tangled web, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what your friend's doing, but you recall that last year, the Russians, and Russian television in particular, or the Russian military, exposed the ISIS oil trade into Turkey, and they bombed a number of those convoys, which had not been touched by US and allied Air Force prior to that, in the year prior to that there was US air power in the region. The Russians started bombing it. They were filming it. I think even the US claimed some of the bombings that the Russians had done. But in Iraq, there was a parallel thing going on in Iraq, where there is a deal between one group of the Iraqi Kurds, which has got to deal with the Turkish government of Erdogan.
Them pesky Kurds.
Yeah, it's a messy business, because, of course, the same man in Turkey is at war with the biggest group of Kurds, which are in Turkey. In Syria, the Syrian Kurds have been leading the resistance against ISIS in the northeast part there, but they're collaborating with Damascus. So, and we've got more or less the beginnings of some sort of US base in that part of the world, making use of a French construction company of which Hillary Clinton was a director. So we've got this whole toxic sort of mix, where there is now a type of, and that French construction company, by the way, was paying some sort of protection money to ISIS in that northeast corner of Syria bordering on Turkey now. So that's an ugly situation there. I have heard also that there are these private operators that work with the US military. They worked with them in Iraq, Blackwater, and the other sorts of groups and so on, are doing these sorts of things. Now, the dangerous part of that for your friend, of course, is that that invites a confrontation, because Syria and their allies are not going to allow partition of the country, or even, particular businesses hived off from Syria, its oil stolen and so on, in a way that has been going on in Iraq for some time, in the north of Iraq. So that could lead to a direct confrontation, where these so-called civilian contractors are going to be human shields, in effect, against the campaign against those terrorist groups. Whether that's deliberate or not, that is to say, whether Washington or the current administration might say that, bomb these people and you're bombing US interests, inviting a escalation of the conflict there, I'm not sure. But it's a very dangerous situation to put in contractors to steal the resources of another country and then have them effectively acting as human shields against those extremist groups who are acting as the proxies for our governments there. So if I were your friend, I wouldn't be going into that situation.
No, absolutely not. It just seems like somebody had a timetable, and thought that this would all be over with by now. We would have toppled Syria 2 years ago.
That's true.
And it's just that it just hasn't happened yet. So to me, it shows the weakness of
we don't have the moral authority. Go ahead, I mean to cut you off.
No, it just shows the weakness, the actual weakness of the United States propaganda machine to cover up this dirty war.
And the dangers of the illusions we are fed, isn't it? Because if you're quite right that it was not even 2 or 3 years ago, it was 5 years ago, people were saying Assad is going. Any moment now, the regime is going to fall. I've documented this in the past, 2011, 2012, a flood of these stories. The regime is crumbling. It has no support. It's killing its own people. No, that wasn't actually happening. And we're all left with this sort of illusion, and people that go into this situation say, well, here's a chance to make some money, and everyone tells me that this regime is over and doesn't control its own country. That's not what's going on. There's the danger for little people, to step into this situation believing all of our own bullshit, more or less, that if you believe that stuff, you put yourself at risk too. That's a wider danger, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this just reminds me of when the Americans fought Britain over the American Revolution. It was only 3% that stood up. Well, it's the same thing with Syria. The West does not have the moral authority. If we're not righteous, you're not going to win an unrighteous war, in my opinion. It's hard. It's hard. You don't have the moral authority. What's your take on that, Doctor?
No, I agree with you entirely. That's the starting point, isn't it, of things? We could go back to Vietnam too and say the same sort of thing. There wasn't the moral authority to enforce American will on Vietnam at that time. That was what was resisting. It was a nationalist resistance, effectively. Of course, they were led by a socialist group, but it was a nationalist resistance in Vietnam. It's a nationalist resistance in Syria. It's a nationalist resistance in Iraq. They've done opinion polls, a lot of opinion polls in the Middle East. And one of the areas where there is most hatred amongst young people for the American presence there is in Iraq, young Iraqi people. Maybe that's unsurprising, but, given all of the sacrifice and all the expense and, the carnage in Iraq, let's remember that is turning into manure now too, because Iraq has joined the Russian, Syrian, Iranian alliance against these extremist groups. And look at all the effort that the US put into trying to secure Iraq as a, compliant or friendly or, Western friendly or whatever, however they saw it. That's not happening now. That's going in the other direction now.
Well, Doctor, the Iraqi people seen their nation get double crossed. Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset. He wasn't a very nice guy in many rights, but but he had a stable country at one point, and then he got double crossed by the United States. So why should they trust us? Why? That's the thing that kills me. Americans, wake up! We've been brainwashed with this American exceptionalism, and I do believe the American people are exceptional, but our government has been hijacked by a gang of offshore crooks that is using our military to protect an investment. They are not out there defending us. They are defending the Federal Reserve, banking cartel, and the military-industrial complex, and all of this. This is what they're defending. If they want to defend us, shut down these foreign bases, bring them home, and let's stop with this foreign entanglement, because our founding fathers said no. Do not get involved. Look, Dr. Tim Anderson, we're coming to a break. Can you stay another segment or two?
Yeah, I can.
Awesome. Great. Look, I want to get into Iran, because I've been hitting Iran, the whole subject of this and this whole psyop that our media has run. Ask yourself, what are the two nations that hate Iran? Israel and Saudi Arabia. Who are the two biggest factors, the foreign factors in our media? It's Saudi Arabia and Israel. Go figure. Wake up, people. Battle of New Orleans Radio will be right back.
Genetic disease, you're parasitical prone, you could never be pleased. Everywhere you've gone, you've been treated for fleas. It's time to delouse the house, we don't need none of these. Arming themselves to the teeth while taking Americans' guns. And all the time they having so much fun. Just take a look what they done. Just take a look, just take a motherfucking look what they done.
They took the gold from Gaddafi and the petrol from Hussein, playing God with Assad's democratic regime. All over your Talmud vision, ISIS is seen, but that big plasma screen is a crisis machine. High definition for the Goyim, holy hola hoax, Elia Ehrenberg's dream. There's too many facets for you to understand the plan. From plundering opium and lithium in Afghanistan to justifying a fraudulent crisis to attack Iran and finalize the greater Israel by taking Pakistan. Just look at the blue borders on their vile flag.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. You're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio right here on 990 AM WGSO. Look, people need to go listen to that song I was just playing, even if you're not a hip-hop fan. I'm not a mainstream hip-hop fan. I listen to anti-New World Order music. Go check out Payday Monsanto's Chosen Knight's Lament, and it goes into a lot of the things that happened, and that are happening in the Middle East. This isn't just some anomaly. This is just, there's a plan. There was a neocon plan in place, for the Middle East, and this plan went public. It came across Wesley Clark's desk, and they're hammering on Iran at this point. And before I get the doctor's take, I want to lay it out for everybody. Okay, they say Iran is our enemy. Okay, let's really look. Let's really take a look what happened to Iran. 1953, CIA takes out Mohammad Mossadegh. They was listening to rock and roll in Iran. Iran was very, very pro-West. Can't have a very pro-West moderate government. We got to destroy them. Let's take them out. Boom, get them out of here. 1979, Western-backed coup of the Shah. We got to get him out of there. And before that happened, we started freezing some of their assets in money. We froze billions of dollars of their assets before that whole funny hostage business of 1979 with the whole October surprise that helped get Ronald Reagan elected. Okay, there was some real funny things with that whole deal. Then I believe it was either 87 or 88 or 89. We blew their commercial passenger liner out of the sky, killing 300 civilians, around about 300 civilians. So, and we have Iran surrounded with bases. While they tell us there's a transgender Iranian under every leaf ready to blow us up, and then the media tries to morph Iran into being ISIS when Iran is the antithesis of ISIS, and they're actually fighting ISIS, and they're not even the same religion. People need to wake up, and you need to read and understand what's really going on. Okay, not all Muslims are the same. Not all sects are the same. Iran they're Persians. They're not Arabians. Okay, there's a whole big difference. Understand the players of the Middle East. Before you just, talk like Ted Cruz and want to make it a glass parking lot. You need to understand what's going on. And then the media perpetrates this lie that Iran just wants to kill all Jews. That's a bunch of poppycock, because there's Jews that have been living in peace in Iran for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There's actual Jews in the government. There's tons of synagogues in Tehran. I've talked to several people that have been to Tehran from America. Not a problem.
But wait, that guy from Center of Security Policy,
Chris Holden,
told me that I was full of it when I asked him. I mentioned the same thing. Talking about, well, if Iran wanted to wipe out all the Jews, why wouldn't they start with the ones in Tehran? And he told me, I was way off target. I was a Martian.
You know why? Because they're listening to that damn faux news network that's owned by a Zionist Jew.
The Fox News Network.
Yeah, the faux news network. It's owned by a Zionist Jew, and the Saudis had interest. Iran's enemy. People, understand, get it together, figure it out. It's 2 + 2 level addition here. Now, go ahead, Doctor. What do you say for everything I just laid out there?
Yeah, you made some good points. I think Iran, the history is important, of course, that there was a lot of resentment at the US backing of the Shah for 25 years. And then, so when they kicked out the US and had that revolution in 1979, they were determined to reinstall their own values. Because the Shah's secret police, the Sabak, had basically repressed and destroyed the secular opposition, the opposition was organized through the mosques. And that's why the character of the Iranian Revolution was an Islamic one in the late 70s. But you're right to point out that was the Iranian Shia Islam is a particular variant which is violently opposed by the Saudis, basically. The Iranians themselves, the way I see it, they don't really play a sectarian role in the region, because the reason why they're hated so much by Israel is because they support the Palestinians. They've supported the Palestinians. There's virtually no Shia Muslims in Palestine. So they've done it across those boundaries. They support Syria, which is a secular or pluralist country, which doesn't want a theocratic state. So all of their allies with Russia, as they've demonstrated recently by allowing the Russians to use their air bases to bomb ISIS, which is major backer is Saudi Arabia. So, you know, they are very anti-imperial, let's say, the Iranians, in the way that they look at the world, but they have never attacked the US directly. They resent the US for what the US has done in the region and done to them, basically.
Well, Dr.
And
Anderson, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
well, if there were a different US policy to the region, a respectful policy, then a lot of that would change.
Yeah, no doubt. You know, I'm gonna throw something out. We only got a couple minutes left. I'm gonna throw something out to you. You know, we're all over this Iran nuclear deal, but hold up. If I was a free nation and all these other nations around me had nuclear weapons, wouldn't you want a nuclear weapon too, Dr. Anderson?
Well, there's logic to that. You know, there's a logic to that. But
I mean, I think
it's extraordinary what happened with that agreement was that it was really an attempt at unilateral disarmament before we get to the detail of it. And there's no real international law backing the idea of unilateral disarmament. We will select one country, Iran, and say that its nuclear power industry could turn into an arms industry, while we turn a blind eye to the fact that Israel has dozens and dozens of nuclear weapons secreted in its allies around the world, basically. So that idea of targeting one country to unilaterally disarm it is part of a bigger plan, basically. Now, the Iranians played their diplomatic cards very carefully. They got some sort of agreement, which the rest of the world is happy with, but the US is still, keeping its options open, because it wants to play that role of the world policeman and the big power, the empire. It doesn't want to say empire, but it's playing the role of the empire without using the words. And that just doesn't work in today's world, basically. People won't respect that. They won't ever respect that.
no, that's a great point. Look, we're coming to a break. We got one more segment with Dr. Tim Anderson. Please go support this man's work. Get the book, The Dirty War in Syria. When we come back, Dr. Anderson, if you don't mind, we have a caller who wants to ask you a question. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio. Please check it out. Tell your friends and family about the show. Go to our YouTube channel, which our great reporter and co-host Caleb Hitt will upload this after the show, the Battle NOLA Radio. Please go hit that subscribe button. Great information. Thank you, Dr. Tim Anderson. We'll be right back with the caller. Brian, hold up 1 second. We'll be right back.
Battle of New Orleans Radio with your hosts Nathan Lawrenson, Caleb Hitt, and Goyam on 990 WGSO.
In 1814, we took
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. You're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio right here, 990 AM WGSO. It's our last segment with the good Dr. Tim Anderson, located there in Sydney, Australia. We appreciate his time. He's written a great book, The Dirty War on Syria. Please support his work and go. You can find it at Global Research. All right, we're going to take a call now. We have Brian on line one. Brian, welcome to the show. Do you have a question for Dr. Tim Anderson?
Yes, I do, Doctor. Thank you so much, Nate. Dr. Anderson, I have a twofold question. One, if you could please talk about the size of the American base that has been built in Australia that most don't even know about exist. And number two, with everything, the tension that is so great right now in the Middle East, it took 6 months for a 23-nation coalition of Muslim nations to get together to have the largest war game in peacetime history in the Middle East. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan were the three big countries. And it was over 350,000 fighting men, not just typists. These were all infantry. There were over 20,000 tanks, and the list goes on and on what they had. It was live fire. There was no reason for with all that's going on right now. There was no reason for them to have that. And what I'm worried is that as we get closer to November, and as muddy and as nasty as this is getting with the American election, is President Obama getting ready to allow a war to break out before or during the November elections? And how y'all were talking about on how the United States is involved with Iran, and as y'all were talking about, is it possible that the United States is getting ready to start a war with Iran, which would pretty much stop the election in the United States? I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for interesting questions. On the first one, there are a lot of relatively small US bases in Australia, but they're mainly intelligence gathering ones. The most famous one is Pine Gap in the centre of Australia, which is a satellite intelligence base there. Some of the more physical bases, like for submarines, are less important these days. Otherwise, there's some docking facilities. You know, the US ships come into Darwin in the north of Australia, but they don't really need a permanent base because there's a lot of direct cooperation with the Australian military and the US military. I don't think there's any new base there, is to say, but there's that ongoing cooperation, and which means that the Australian forces are technically also, like militarily with equipment and so on, integrated into US forces in a lot of foreign operations. In relation to Iran, I don't really think the situation is very dangerous, I think, for this reason, that the US is, through its proxy groups, the Islamist groups in Syria and Iraq, the US is losing. And that's dangerous because the US doesn't like to lose, doesn't know how to lose well. And so there's always that danger of escalation. But the other side to that coin is that there hasn't really been a stomach for an open or a widely escalated war, despite the language, from the beginning, I don't think. We've seen a number of points where there could have been escalation. Remember that the lies that were told about the Syrian government using chemical weapons just when the Syrian government invited chemical weapons inspectors to Damascus in August 2013. When that stunt was carried out, basically, Obama didn't show any stomach for escalation at that time. Even when they were talking about a strike, they were talking about a limited, I think Joe Biden said, incredibly limited strike or something like that. What does that mean in war terms? Nothing really. You know, you can kill people. The danger is they are killing people, and they have been killing people, and they're rattling the sabers about Iran. But in the end, remember, they backed off on Iran. They backed off on Iran with that weapons deal strategically because they had their hands full with Syria. And although Mr. Netanyahu in Israel didn't like that at the time, it was a calculated move, I believe, by Washington to say, look, you know, one thing at a time here. So Iran, I believe, from the US establishment point of view, is on the back burner effectively, and I don't think there's a plan for any escalation, let alone in the, what do they call it, the lame duck years of the Obama presidency. Really, I don't believe that he wants to go out on that sort of note. Hillary Clinton is another story, but I believe that Hillary Clinton, although she's connected to all that politics of the dirty wars, I don't believe that there would be the stomach for an escalation at that time. So I think it's very dangerous for the people of the region, and the provocations against Russia in Eastern Europe are another factor we need to link in there. You might have noticed, if you were following some of the media about Europe and NATO, that there's been a lot of reaction in Europe against these provocations against Russia. I was in Germany just a month or so ago, and one opinion poll there showed that more than 90% of the German people were against these provocations on the border of Russia. They wanted a good relationship with Russia. So there's that sort of factor there too. So I think while it's very dangerous what's going on with the attempt to build a base on the edge of Turkey and northeast Syria, and to try and play the Kurdish card to try and get leverage in the region and divide Iraq and Iran, that all is very dangerous, and many people are losing their lives in the Middle East. I don't believe there is a stomach for a wider escalation in Washington. That's just my estimate.
I sure hope you're right, Professor. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of some of Putin's speeches lately, but I don't know if it was last week or a week or two ago, where he was talking about, the U.S. basically, creating these Islamic, excuse me, I'm having trouble here. These Islamic terrorist organizations as proxy armies, and turning them loose on Russia's border, and
Yeah,
Putin saying this. I mean,
yeah.
goodness gracious, I wish we would have, a leader that had the kahunas to say such a thing.
Yeah, well, Mr. Putin, of course, had that experience with Chechnya in the south of the Caucasus, and that was a very similar type of operation. The Saudis were funding that also to try and divide, to try and weaken Russia, and it was Putin that actually worked out a diplomatic / military solution to that one, and they more or less solved it. But they're very alive to the fact that in the South Caucasus there, with significant Muslim populations, that some sort of sectarian operations can be whipped up by those outside of Russia, in particular Saudi Arabia. So that's sort of course, why there's a lot of Russian support for what Putin's doing in Syria. They know that it's a preemptive thing, that it does affect them directly, much more than it affects the US, for example. The Europeans, for their part, are seeing that they're getting the blowback from these operations too. The attacks across Europe are a type of blowback, and the Europeans have been responsible for the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So that blowback is something that's affecting the Europeans more than it's affecting the US too. So, there's a big game going on. They used to call the Great Game, the battle, the competition between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Then it became the Cold War, the Soviet bloc versus the US bloc. The Great Game is still going on there, and we have to look at these conflicts in that wider context.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, Doctor, we have one more caller. We only got a couple minutes left, so let's knock this call out. We have on line 3 the Flaming Liberal.
Who was flaming before flaming was cool. Now, I don't want to be rude to your guest. I really called to discuss the presidential campaign. So if you like, you can put me back on hold. And if there's time.
All right, we'll put you back on hold, Flaming Liberal. Appreciate you calling. Yeah, Dr. Tim Anderson is on the line with us from Sydney, Australia. He's written a great book, The Dirty War on Syria. Please go check it out. I can't wait to read it. You can find his work on Global Research. That's a great website as well. So what's the end game here, Doctor? What can we do? I don't know. This is like the one issue I try to beat home to people, and it just, I don't know. It's like it falls on deaf ears. I don't know. What do we do?
From the US point of view, I think, that really there needs to be a sea change in terms of the way that trying to reshape the Middle East is going, and pushing the borders of NATO on that eastern side and the southeastern side there. That's really the problem for the US, because you see the situation in Syria is changing rapidly. When the Syrian army with its backers, with Russia and Iran, take back Aleppo, and that's going to be fairly soon now, there'll be very few assets that the NATO countries have got on the ground there. They'll have to find a way out. They'll have to find a way out to climb down. I think that Mr. Putin is probably going to be the best chance, because he seems to have enough goodwill and enough skill to create a diplomatic cover for the back down that someone in Washington is going to have to do here. That saying that it's going to be quite false, but it's going to be clever diplomacy to say thank you to President Obama, for example, or whoever it is, for helping bring about peace, in Syria, and helping resolve this issue. I think Mr. Putin's capable of doing that, because he's not a confrontative type. He's looking for a way out for his Western partners, as he keeps calling them, all the way while he realizes, what the real game is. So I think there's going to have to some sort of climb down by the US in a way that they did it with Iran. Effectively, they put Iran onto the back burner. There were several years, I remember, we were on the edge of World War III against Iran, and there was a climb down there that was covered up very nicely, basically. That sort of operation, I think, has to happen in Syria to stop the killing, to try and stabilize the situation, let those ordinary people get on with their lives and decide their own systems for themselves.
Man, that's a great point. Let them decide for themselves. We don't need to play bring democracy everywhere, because that's not, we don't even live in a democracy. It's a bunch of BS. Professor, we really enjoyed the conversation. I really look forward to reading your book, and it was very enlightening. I can't wait to go back and re-listen. So, man, God bless. Thank you for your work, and I look forward to having you on again.
Thanks.
All right, appreciate it, sir. Battle New Orleans Radio. Be right back.
You may take